Before I get started, actually, with my talk, I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way because a lot of people ask me about the nickname Hoppin' John, and it's actually the most boring thing I have to say, so I'm going to go ahead and just tell you what it is now. In 1985, I was apprenticing at Knock Waxman's great culinary bookstore in New York, Kitchen Arts and Letters, preparing to open my own culinary bookstore in Charleston. And I was trying to come up with a name for the shop, and I was leaning toward the educated palate, which was soundly rebuffed by every single person I knew. On New Year's Day, I was going to the home of a fellow Southerner who was having a traditional feast, and I said, I'll bring the Hoppin' John. And I got there, it was a freezing day. Freezing. I'm buzzing this thing. I've got this big pot of Hoppin' John. Hurry up, let me in. I'm freezing. I've got the Hoppin' John. And everybody was already at his apartment, and you could hear everybody in the apartment over the little intercom thing going, "No, you are Hoppin' John." And anyway, the name stuck. So that's out of the way. I was born in Baton Rouge, actually, but I moved to the very similar terrain of the South Carolina Low Country when I was 3 years old. So I've eaten Creole cooking all my life. The first recipe that I know of for Hoppin' John, first published recipe, the first written recipe, which is the national dish of the Low Country, by the way, appeared in the Carolina Housewife in 1847. Writing anonymously, as was the custom for Charleston women prior to the 19th Amendment, Sarah Rutledge was the, quote, lady of Charleston who penned this early American cookbook that established Low Country cooking as a Creole cookery separate from the other cuisines emerging throughout the South. She was the daughter of Edward Rutledge, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and she was the niece of Arthur Middleton, another signer. Her version, calling for bacon, red peas, and rice, these red peas, African, is a Charleston perlo, as we say, pilaf, or pilaf, a bean and rice jambalaya, if you will. Miss Rutledge suggested adding, if liked, a sprig of green mint. The Low Country Classic, served on New Year's Day for good luck, is a very dry version of the dish, but it's served with greens for financial success throughout the year with their juices, as well as a side dish of more cowpeas and pot liquor. Most folks today use black-eyed peas, which are one of many types of cowpeas. More about them in a moment. The dish certainly came from West Africa, whence came both cowpeas and the enslaved, who were great growers and cookers of rice. Wherever rice is grown in the world, you'll find dishes of rice and legumes whose synergy is legend. More on that in a moment as well. You're also going to hear me quote Dr. Carney a lot, and if you have not read her books, I have to beg you to get these books and read them, both Black Rice and In the Shadow of Slavery. They reflect remarkable talent and amazing scholarship. The white men who owned the vast rice plantations in early Carolina on which the fortunes of Charleston were built probably knew little about rice prior to their arrival in the New World, where they found themselves owners of not only vast plantations, but humans as well. It is to the ancestors of today's African Americans that I raise my glass on New Year's with our meal of Hoppin' John, collards, sweet potatoes, and roast pork, for it is they, from the West African rice coast, who knew the systems of wetland rice cultivation, they who cleared the land, built the embankments, cultivated the floodplains, sowed the seeds, maintained the weeding, harvested the crop, hoed the stubble, burned the remains, threshed the sheaves, winnowed with baskets of their own making, milled with mortars and pestles of their own making, and finally it was they who cooked the rice. As I have written many times before, neither the French nor the English who owned the rice plantations in Carolina knew much of anything about rice cookery, and I dare say that they still don't. An aside. My dear friend and colleague, the late great culinary historian Karen Hess, speculated in her seminal work, The Carolina Rice Kitchen, The African Connection, that there's a Provençal connection to the Perlos of Carolina. In Charleston, you might hear pilot, perlo, or perlu, or several other pronunciations of the word, but I always say Perlo no matter how it's spelled. I mean, you don't say Burgundy or Calliope Street, do you? Hess wrote, Perlo is the most characteristic dish of the Carolina Rice Kitchen. Word and dish come from Persia. The classic Perlo is not so much a receipt as a culinary concept. 20 pages later, as she traces the Perlo following Islam through Turkey and Spain to Paris as early as 1300 and to Provençal cookbooks in the 19th century, she hypothesized that the Perlo was brought to Carolina by Huguenots fleeing persecution. Karen asked me to read the manuscript twice before publication, and twice I protested. But she countered in the book, not calling me by name. It's been objected that most Huguenots in Carolina did not come from Provence or even the Midi, considering that some of the most important strongholds were in the Midi, particularly in the Cévennes. Adjacent to Provence, it seems reasonable to suppose that there must at least have been a few, nor does the objection take into account the compelling presence of rice in South Carolina. Well, her supposition that since the rest of the French and English settlers would have known nothing about rice cookery, but even a single family from Provence could very well have introduced such a concept into the new rice land, diminishes the very strength of the major thesis of her work, which she calls the skill of the African American cooks who had long known rice cookery, almost surely including certain versions of Perlo. Culinary history is fascinating stuff, but these days I'm far more interested in both the big picture and the cultural aspects of food. And what I'm here to talk about today is Hoppin' John, a bean and rice Perlo which has traveled from the low country plantations to wherever both white and black Southerners have settled. Before Miss Rutledge provided us with a recipe, Caroline Howard Gilman wrote in her Recollections of a Southern Matron in 1838, Lo, there stood before Papa a pig on his 4 feet, with a lemon between his teeth and a string of sausages around his neck. His grin was horrible. Before me, though at the head of many delicacies provided by Papa, was an immense field of Hoppin' John. A good dish, to be sure, but no more presentable to strangers at the South than baked beans and pork in New England. I had not self-possession to joke about the unsightly dish, nor courage to offer it. I glanced at Papa. What is that mountain before you, my daughter? Said Papa, looking comically over his pig. Caroline Howard was a proper Bostonian who married Samuel Gilman, a Harvard graduate who became the minister of the Archdale Unitarian Church in Charleston in 1819, which was a position he kept for 40 years. She was neither Southern nor the mistress of the plantation she purported to be in her recollections. She published under her own name, which is unheard of for a woman in Carolina society. Charleston lady's name appeared in print only upon birth, marriage, and death until the passage of the 19th Amendment. Hence Sarah Rutledge, by Lady of Charleston. She did own house servants, and most historians agree that her observations of daily life are poignant and relevant, however fictional. Her scene of Hoppin' John's appearance at the table, which she felt necessary to footnote and explain as, quote, bacon and rice, is perhaps the first of many to follow in Southern writing. In 1946, Carson McCullers wrote in The Member of the Wedding, they stopped off for a few minutes to get on with the dinner. F. Jasmine sat with her elbows on the table and her bare heels hooked on the rungs of the chair. She and Bernice sat opposite each other, and John Henry faced the window. Now, Hoppin' John was F. Jasmine's very favorite food. She had always wanted them to wave a plate of rice and peas before her nose when she was in her coffin to make sure there was no mistake. For if a breath of life was left in her, she would sit up and eat, but if she smelled the Hoppin' John and did not stir, they could just nail down the coffin and be certain she was truly dead. Now, Bernice had chosen for her death test a piece of fresh fried water trout, and for John Henry it was divinity fudge. But though Jasmine loved the Hoppin' John the very best, the others also liked it well enough, and all three of them enjoyed the dinner that day, the ham knuckle, the Hoppin' John, cornbread, hot-baked sweet potatoes, and the buttermilk. In the passage, McCullers spells hoppin' both with and without the final G, and she hyphenates the words. How to spell, it's always been sort of a problem. The Member, The Wedding is fiction, but is said to be the most autobiographical of her works, and the character Frankie, who's the F. Jasmine of the cited passage, is the one of all of her many who seem to her family and friends most like the author herself, according to the author's sister, Margarita Smith. Set in a small southern town in the 1940s, the book is a brilliant window into adolescence, but it illuminates the culture as well. Just before Hoppin' John makes its appearance, we read, "Don't call me Frankie," she said. "I don't wish to have to remind you anymore." It was that time of the early afternoon when in the old days a sweet band would be playing. Now with the radio turned off, the kitchen was solemn and silent, and there were sounds from far away. A colored voice called from the sidewalk, calling the names of vegetables in a dark, slurred tone, a long, unwinding hollering in which there were no words. Somewhere near in the neighborhood, there was the sound of a hammer, and each stroke left a round echo. McCullough could simultaneously draw broad strokes and pinpoints of light. Hoppin' John was part of her world, and it was part of Tennessee Williams's. Southern food and drink are often major characters in his plays, and in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Big Mama knows how to satisfy Big Daddy. Big Mama. Did you all notice the food he ate at the table? Did you all notice the supper he put away? Why, he ate like a hoss, while that man ate a huge piece of cornbread with molasses on it. Helped himself twice to Hoppin' John. Margaret. Big Daddy loves Hoppin' John. We had us a real country dinner. Big Mama. Yeah, he simply adores it. And candy jams, that man put away enough food at that table to stuff a field hand. Gooper. I hope he don't have to pay for it later on. Big Mama. Why should Big Daddy suffer for satisfying a normal appetite? I'm not going to try to paint a picture of the rice plantation in South Carolina or the knowledge system that came with the enslaved from West Africa. That's Judy Carney's territory. And we've heard from our other distinguished guests about Latin American and Caribbean beans and rice. But I grew up with Hoppin' John in the land of cowpeas, and I'd like to take the argument down a notch, back to the very soil. I need not say much about rice, for until my gentleman planter friend Dick Schultz reintroduced Carolina Gold to the Lowcountry in the 1980s, there had been virtually no rice grown in the area in 60 years. And to answer your earlier question, the Civil War had taken away the slave labor, the grain had been introduced into Arkansas, Louisiana, California, and Texas, where the new machinery, as Judith said, was too heavy for the soft Lowcountry soil, which was too heavy. This made competition impossible for the Lowcountry rice planters, whose aging plantations were battered by a series of storms, freshets, and silting caused by upriver cotton farming. Interestingly, though, people still ate rice at nearly every meal in South Carolina, and many sandlappers, as residents of the Lowcountry are apt to call themselves, continue to do so. When Fritz Hollings was elected governor of South Carolina in 1958, he learned that its largely rural population was suffering from malnutrition, even though they were eating the same foods they had eaten since the end of the Civil War. He funded a study of the diets of the malnourished and found that all of the rice being eaten in the state was also imported. Stripped of its nutrients in the milling process, it was filling bellies but not sustaining life. He rushed a bill through the state legislature requiring that all rice sold in the state be fortified with the vitamins and minerals stripped off in the milling process. Further, directions must instruct the cook not to wash the rice before cooking, which would rinse away those restored nutrients. The law, incidentally, is still in the books in South Carolina. But let's move on to those red peas that I passed around, the ones that Sarah Rutledge called for in the earliest of written recipes for Hoppin' John. Many food writers, and not just food writers, many journalists seem to think that boiled peanuts and grits are the defining foods of the South. But I gotta tell you, I sell stone ground, whole grain, heirloom corn grits to people in every single state, and many of my customers are chefs in restaurants. Many restaurants here in Louisiana use my grits. Donald Link does. At Herb Saint and Cochon, there's several restaurants who use them. And the truth of the matter is, most of the people I sell grits to are not Southerners. And the Lee brothers have popularized boiled peanuts in New York City though I do think that the popularity of edamame, the boiled green soybeans of sushi bars, which are similar in texture and flavor, also help boiled peanuts' visibility. Everyone's heard of black-eyed peas, perhaps the best known of the cowpeas, but no one would call them red. And there's even an heirloom California black eye, but few Americans outside the Deep South grow or eat the myriad other varieties of Vigna unguiculata. And forgive me, those of y'all who are botanists, because the nomenclature, both scientific and common, can be absolutely maddening. Even the botanists can't agree on the pronunciations, and subspecies continue to be isolated. All peas and beans, including Vigna, which are the cowpeas, Pisum, the green peas, Glycine, the soybeans, Cajanus, the pigeon peas, and Phaseolus, or the common beans, such as lima beans, black beans, navy beans, and green beans, all belong to the legume family, Fabaceae, which means fava-like, that is, they resemble old world beans. There are both subtle and culinary differences among the peas and beans. Red beans and rice, for example, does not taste like Hoppin' John, but unripe cowpeas in the pod can be eaten like unripe common green beans. At the turn of the last century, Sturtevant classified cowpeas with pigeon peas, which also came with the slave trade from Africa, but today cowpeas are recognized as a separate genus. They are neither peas, as in green peas, nor beans, as in green beans or fava beans, but you may hear them called both. If you hear a Southerner talking about shelling peas, he means cowpeas, which are also known as Crowders, field peas, and tellingly Southern peas. Crowders are so called, some say, because the beans are crammed together in the pod, squaring off the shoulders of the peas. But William Wise Weaver, the food historian and master gardener, has written that as poor whites began to eat them in the 18th century, they began to call them Crowder peas from the Scotch-Irish word crowdy, meaning a porridge. Tom Fitzmaurice, here in New Orleans, the venerable restaurant sleuth, says the name comes from the practice of planting them in cotton fields where they would crowd and fertilize the rows. Yet another shelling bean of the South is the butter bean or civet bean, but that's a whole nother ball game. As are yard-long beans, which resemble green beans, but which are a subspecies of Vigna unguiculata, though they originated in Asia, not in Africa, and are not directly related to New World beans. Are you confused enough yet? This is why scientific nomenclature is essential, regardless of how it's pronounced. Cowpeas are as varied as grapes or apples, and Southerners tend to crave the type that was grown in their neck of the woods. I'm partial to cream peas and some of the lesser-known black-eye types, such as whippoorwills, but truth be told, I love them all. Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1798 that the cowpea is very productive, excellent food for man and beast. He praised the plant's ability to improve the tilth and fertility of the soil, and he sowed them in the South Orchard at Monticello between 1806 and 1810. Perhaps the cowpea's reputation as both fodder and soil enhancer has kept it off tables, because the season is actually not too long for most American climates, for many American climates. Weaver grows several, in fact, in his awe-inspiring garden in Devon, Pennsylvania. Mine matured as quickly as my tomatoes and squash, and before my corn and melons in my Washington, D.C. community garden, and that's how it should be. Native Americans knew all about the companion planting that we are all learning about now as gardening has become one of the country's most popular pastimes. The three sisters are the trinity of corn, beans, and squash planted together. The corn provides a pole for the beans to grow up, and the beans restore the nitrogen that the corn demands back into the soil, and the squash rambles on the ground, providing shade, locking moisture to block out the sun, and blocking out the sun rays on which weeds thrive. Further, the prickly stems of squash plants deter insects. Jesus quoted the Torah when he said that man does not live by bread alone, imploring his flock to cultivate spiritual health as well. I personally choose to believe that the ancient texts were based on far more practical homilies. That is, grains do not provide us with all that we need to live. Neither wheat, nor corn, nor rice can sustain life. They lack certain amino acids to form complete proteins. When grains are combined with pulses, however, complete proteins become accessible to humans. The enslaved West Africans who arrived in Carolina had for centuries grown cowpeas and pigeon peas to complement their rice, as well as root vegetables, greens, and other grains such as millet and sorghum, most of which quickly became established in the New World, or they were replaced with similar plants. Many of the enslaved were also excellent herdsmen and understood free-ranging cattle long before and much better than their European masters. As Judith explained in Black Rice, in the vast wetlands of the inland Niger Delta, following rice harvest, cattle entered the fields to graze on the stubble, their manure fertilizing the soil. This seasonal rotation between rice cultivation and pastoralism embraces a clever land use strategy that satisfies both cereal and protein needs while improving crop yields through the addition of animal manure. Rice farmers farther south, in the absence of cattle, rely on other techniques to maintain soil fertility, such as rotating fields and nitrogen-fixing legumes and interplanting crops that add crucial nutrients to the soil. In her latest book, Dr. Carney points out that the practice of leaving cattle to graze on the plant's leavings is likely responsible for the plant's alternative names in English: cowpea, Portuguese, ervilha de vaca, and Spanish, chícharo de vaca. It's too bad that future Southerners didn't pay more attention to the successful and sophisticated Native American and African farming techniques. Monoculture, as we know, has continued to destroy even the smallest farmers in the South, who have gone from one ill-fated crop such as cotton to another, such as the Christmas trees that replaced heirloom corn and bean patches throughout Appalachia, and now are all dying from root rot and acid rain. But I digress. In Carolina, the taste for the cowpeas and rice and sorghum and greens and sesame seeds that came to Carolina with the slave trade from West Africa early on. By 1708, there was a black majority in South Carolina. When I was growing up, there were over 300 varieties of cowpeas being grown in the Low Country. Interestingly, when they're fresh, we call them field peas, but when they're dried is when we call them cowpeas. I don't know if that's true elsewhere, but that's certainly true in South Carolina. And they were being grown on these small traditional truck farms throughout the country. But by the time I opened my store in 1986, nearly all of them had disappeared, until the interest in heirloom plants took off a few years ago. Now, through the efforts of dedicated farmers, seed savers, universities, and nonprofit organizations such as Monticello and the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation and Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, and scholars such as Will Weaver and Stephen Faciola, I can type in the name of just about any heirloom cowpea variety into my browser and probably find someone with seeds to sell me, which is really great. In Washington, I've grown Mississippi Silvers, Razorbacks, Purple Hulls, and Clay cowpeas, which was a rare old favorite of Confederate soldiers who both added them to their rations, and they planted them along the battlefield stations as well for sustenance. One of the great beauties of growing them is that you can eat them fresh. I simply boil a piece of smoked ham hock or neck bones in water until it's seasoned, then I add the fresh peas and cook on a low boil for about a half hour. Or you can save the dried beans for winter use, though let me advise you, if you grow your own, you better freeze them first to kill any critters. There's nothing more disheartening than opening your pantry on New Year's Day to find your precious stash of whippoorwills riddled with bugs. Sometimes I can harvest both green and dried cowpeas on the same day from the same plants. Cowpeas will grow right up until frost. Then you simply leave the plants in the ground to provide nutrients for next year's corn. Cowpeas are favored all over the world now, and wherever you find them, you're also likely to find rice. And wherever you find rice, you're likely to find some form of rice and beans. In a recent Facebook exchange, I followed several well-known Southern cookbook authors' discussion of what they thought was Southern and what wasn't. "I draw the line at Saigon rice," wrote one. "I don't care how many Vietnamese live down here now." I couldn't resist butting in and telling her that we've known for several years that cowpeas got to Asia several thousand years before they got to America. In Vietnam, incidentally, rice and black-eyed peas are cooked just like Hoppin' John, though the street vendors who offer them to you will probably have a stalk of lemongrass garnishing it in lieu of Miss Rutledge's suggested mint. It's no wonder that the black eye type became the defining cowpea of the dish as it spread across the country in what I like to call the southern diaspora. Mature at 65 to 70 days, it doesn't require the 85 to 90 or more days that many of the other more delicate lady peas, cream peas, and white acres do. The common names are as confusing as the scientific nomenclature, and like barbecue and jambalaya, the way you like your Hoppin' John probably has more to do with where you grew up than actual taste. Hoppin' John has managed to keep its name, but even the same varieties of cowpeas seem to change names as you cross county lines. You can grow them anywhere you have full sun and warm, well-drained soil. Their ability to grow in very poor soil is legendary, but they still remain mostly a southern vegetable. Like many African plants, they're extremely versatile, though few people today on this side of the Atlantic use the old foodways. The green seeds can be roasted like peanuts, the leaves can be used as a pot herb, and in hard times you can dark roast the seeds as a coffee substitute. Weaver claims that their close association with African Americans and the New England perception of the peas as a fodder crop for slaves kept them out of not only non-Southern gardens, but also out of the books. But not out of the literature, so to speak, for Thomas Jefferson described raising a black-eyed pea he referred to as French, though many varieties are now thought to have come to America via the Caribbean or Brazil rather than directly from Africa. That would certainly make sense in Carolina, which was granted to some Barbadian planters who had restored Charles II to the throne. Nevertheless, Weaver writes, cowpeas are not generally considered among the vegetables fit for the kitchen garden. Because cowpeas requires considerable space, they've been treated as field crops. On the other hand, they're no more troublesome in this respect than sweet potatoes, and the bush varieties can be raised like bush beans. If there's a drawback, it's only that cowpeas cannot be grown in much of the country due to their need for a long, warm growing season. For this reason, their culture is most closely associated with the South. In 1879, Marion Cabell Tyree edited the remarkable Housekeeping in Old Virginia, containing contributions from 250 of Virginia's noted housewives distinguished for their skill in the culinary art and other branches of domestic economy. In it, there appears, attributed to Moses Adams, and Moses is spelled Mosisaddums, quote, a recipe for cooking cornfield peas, complete with condescending dialect, which is this spelling device used by a writer to establish a sympathetic sense of superiority between himself and his reader as contrasted with the character's dialect. Such spellings can be effective in fiction, but they mostly serve to denigrate the speaker by making him seem uncouth and illiterate. There was no Moses Adams. It was one of several pseudonyms for the blowhard racist George William Bagby, who wrote the Old Virginia Gentleman, in which I read some of the most disturbingly bigoted diatribes I've ever encountered. Field peas were so dear to Bagby's heart, however, that he argued in an almost incomprehensible passage that Virginians were the greatest people on earth simply because they live where cornfield peas grow. In spite of his hysterical racist ranting, he does demonstrate one truism. In the South, the white man came to love the black man's food. Two more recipes appear in Tyree's book. One for cornfield or black-eyed peas submitted by Mrs. S.T., who happens to be Tyree herself, reads, shell early in the morning, throw into water until an hour before dinner, then put into boiling water, covering close while cooking. Add a little salt just before taking from the fire. Drain and serve with a large spoonful of fresh butter, or put in a pan with a slice of fat meat and simmer a few minutes. Dried peas must be soaked overnight and cooked twice as long as fresh. Mrs. Tyree's advice to salt only just before serving shows what black South Carolinians would call an old hand, referring to the wisdom of experience that makes good cooks. Salt toughens peas and beans, so it's prudent to avoid salting them while they cook. Mary Randolph, the Virginia housewife of 1824, had long before waxed poetic about field peas. There are many varieties of these peas, she wrote. The smaller kind are the most delicate. Have them young and newly gathered, shell and boil until tender, Pour them into a colander to drain. Put some lard in a frying pan. When it boils, mash the peas and fry them in a cake of light brown. Put the dish with the crust uppermost and garnish with thin bits of fried bacon. Well, so much for California chef Jeremiah Tower's laughable claim to have invented the bean cake in the 1980s. Many cookbook authors add their own chips through the years. Lettice Bryan advised in the Kentucky Housewife in 1839 to harvest the peas when full grown and the pods just beginning to turn yellow. Then they have their full flavor and are perfectly tender and may be shelled without difficulty. But in just as many Southern cookbooks, recipes for vegetables and fish are conspicuous in their absence. I'm convinced that the cooks assumed that you would know the most important thing about both. Don't overcook them. Prior to the 20th century, when rice is mentioned, it is mostly in Carolina and Georgia cookbooks, or the recipes clearly have a Carolina provenance. I like to think that Miss Rutledge published her version of Hoppin' John, like many Charlestonians after her, myself included, as an attempt to get the old slave recipes down on paper before those days were over. Surely Hoppin' John had long been a favorite on the master's table by the time her recipe appeared in 1847. We culinary historians generally agree that written recipes lag many years behind common usage. Rutledge and the Virginian Randolph were both from aristocratic families. When Randolph wrote about rice, she was writing about Carolina rice cookery. But she didn't mention Hoppin' John, and it's rarely mentioned outside the rice-growing Low Country until much, much later. Immediately after the Civil War, Mrs. Hill's Southern Practical Cookery and Receipt Book appeared in Atlanta. Fish and vegetables are finally given their due. For asparagus, she warns, take them up as soon as done. Too much cooking injures the color and flavor. Vegetables intended for dinner, she wrote, should be gathered early in the morning. A few only can be kept 12 hours without detriment. They lose their good appearance and flavor if cooked too long. Her deviled crabs are made with fresh olive oil. Frog legs are broiled or fried. Their meat is beautifully tender. The taste is delicious, she wrote. And she included her version of Hoppin' John. Pick out the defective ones from a quart of dried peas, soak them several hours in tepid water, boil them with a chicken or a piece of pickled pork until the peas are thoroughly done. In a separate stew pan, boil half as much rice dry. Take the peas from the meat, mix them with the rice, fry for a few minutes until dry, season with salt and pepper. After the Civil War, however, much of the South was emasculated and poor. Many formerly wealthy landowners struggled on small plots of land, just as did the African Americans. Coincidentally, industrialization and the modern railway system brought cheap canned and dried foods to areas where everyone had once eaten fresh, local produce. Refrigeration was also introduced about this time, too, and so there were refrigerated cars. And so it was mostly after the war that the simple foods began to be embraced by the former gentry, when overcooked canned vegetables became the norm, and when the South came to be defined as hog meat and hoe cake. There have been many conjectures about the name Hoppin' John. Karen Hess was convinced and attempted to prove through assiduous research that the dish comes from the Old Persian bahata kacham, meaning cooked rice and beans, from Hindi and Malay origins. Her sources are historical, etymological, and sociological. It makes sense, but I'm not convinced. Though it's certainly more compelling than the folk etymologies surrounding the dish. In summary, this is what we know. Field peas, and probably rice as well, came to Carolina from West Africa, along with Africans who knew how to cook both, and together. The dish spread throughout the South. Favored varieties of the peas were saved. New varieties appeared through selective seed saving and breeding. Dishes of rice and beans are served throughout rice-growing lands as a sort of good luck dish associated with a harvest of both grain and pulse. In the antebellum low-country rice fields, the new year marked the ancient celebration of days becoming longer and the one time when field hands could take a break from the back-breaking work of rice cultivation. As descendants of those enslaved moved inland, and Southerners, both black and white, spread throughout the land, the dish and custom traveled with them. I honestly don't care what you call it, but you better serve it to me if I'm at your house on New Year's Day. I don't think I've ever not had it on New Year's, and I seem to have had pretty damn good luck. Thank you.